Hello, everyone, and welcome everyone to our 8th webinar in the Reimagining the Creative Arts Curriculum and Canon series. This webinar series is presented with support from the National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning in Higher Education and NUI Galway. We are delighted to welcome 4 excellent speakers to contribute to our discussion today, which will focus on theatre for young audiences, education, and practice. I'll happily introduce to you our first speaker today, which is Aideen Howard. Welcome, Aideen. Aideen is the director of the ARC Cultural Centre for Children in Temple Bar, Dublin. She has worked in theatre and the arts for over 2 decades as an artistic director, a producer, and commissioner of new work. Her leadership of the ARC combines advocacy and art making for children in the belief that they have a right to art and culture, as set out in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Aideen is a ministerial nominee to the National Advisory Council on Children, where her focus is the inclusion of art and culture in national policy making. She is also a member of the Creative Youth Expert Advisory Group and a member of the Voluntary Steering Committee of the National Campaign for the Arts since 2017. Prior to the ARC, Aideen was literary director of the Abbey Theatre and is editor of Irish Shorts, New Plays from the Abbey Theatre. Aideen was founding artistic director of the multidisciplinary Mermaid Arts Centre. In 2014, she curated the poetry program of the Mountains to Sea Festival. She recently returned to education and completed a certificate in children's rights at Queen's University and a certificate in governance at UCD. You're very welcome, Aideen.
Thank you so much, Heidi. And thank you all for the invitation to take part in today's discussion. I was saying to my colleagues earlier, I'm a talking head. I won't be sharing screens. I won't be sharing any video with you. But at the end of the talk, we'll be able to share some clips of the work that I refer to. So thank you for the invitation. And more broadly, as well as thanks, I want to acknowledge the organizers of this series of discussions for ensuring that children are included in the considerations of canon, curriculum, and creativity. Because unsurprisingly, that's where my thinking and my remarks today will begin. And what I mean by that is that much of what I'm talking about today begins in the acknowledgement that whatever the context, whether it's social, political, fiscal, commercial, philosophical, academic, children and young people are still not considered to be equal, despite the legal obligations of the state. And the arts is no different in many respects. So before I share my experience of this and what its impact on theatre making for children is, I would like to share a little bit of the social and policy context that informs the environment we work in, and also give you a sense of how our own work at the ARC in an attempt to create repertoire is not just an art making process, but it's also an advocacy process. And it seems to me that those two things are intrinsically linked in the area of art making for children and professional practice. So I'll refer to some of the work that we have made over the last number of years and give you a sense of how we think about it as being outside of any kind of traditional canonical thinking. And I'll be sharing this from a practical and a producer's point of view, and hoping that some of the questions that I raise about the status of the work and the nature of how children's work is treated and considered, that you may have some of the answers to some of the questions that I raise. First, though, I think, although I have set out my stall with my assertion that we have a long way to go before children are treated equally within our society and our republic, there has been a great deal of policy change that has been really positive and progressive over the last 25 years in particular, but also more broadly in the 30 years since Ireland ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And my own organization, the ARC, was set up shortly after that ratification in the full flush of enthusiasm around that time. But also within the intervening 30 years, a great deal has changed for children in a legislative framework as much as in the policy end of things. We now have a full minister for children at Cabinet, arguably with a larger and greater portfolio than ever before. We have a very active Department of Children, which has led participation practice across the world, and whose child participation policies have been copied and replicated in Europe and further afield. We have an Ombudsman for Children, which has become an incredibly useful remedy for many children's rights issues. And we have a special rapporteur for child protection, acknowledging the very difficult and complex history of the way that Ireland has treated children institutionally over the years. And then another example of leadership in terms of Irish policy was the removal of the defence of reasonable chastisement. So all of these things I'm charting very broadly give you a sense of a country that is moving more progressively towards its an equal consideration of children. And in that time, the ecology for art making in general, and theatre making in particular, has also changed. As I mentioned, the ARC was set up 3 years just after the ratification of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. The following year, your own Galway's Barbaro was set up. Kids Own, as a child rights inspired organization, was set up the same year. So in and around that time, you can identify a lot of change beginning. And although, of course, there are extraordinary theatre companies and artist-led theatre companies operating before and after that period, I'm referencing the ARC and Barbaro in particular because it kind of heralds the emerging thinking of a new way of considering children as participants, audience members, and artists. So this shift is important to reference. As I say, the ARC was inspired by the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and principally inspired by Article 31. And since its founding has considered that the delivery of children's right to art and culture is a fundamental part of its existence. So the other thing to take into account in terms of the theatre making process I want to set out is that, as I understand it, the ARC's foundation was also a self-conscious move away from the previous model of theatre making for children, as exemplified by, for example, the great work done by Team Theatre Company, because that model was primarily based on the idea that the theatre would go to where the children were and therefore was primarily presented within school environments. The ARC setup self-consciously located itself in a building that was designed with children in mind and asserted the idea that there was a dedicated professional space for children's art making. And I think that's an important thing to point out because there was a lot of work happening simultaneously in the education system, which was trying to redress the lack of arts representation within the curriculum. The new curriculum in 1971, the Benson Report in 1979, which identified weaknesses in the provision of arts for children, both in school and the community. All of these things were having an impact on the way that art for children was being discussed. So I don't have the time or the scope to adequately chart the policy shifts. I'm referring to them really broadly here. But all of this has led us to a place where we now see children named centrally within the Arts Council's Making Great Artwork strategy, and the beginning of a new approach in creative schools, which I would argue is actually the beginning of the implementation of that Benson report from 1979. So that's a quick tour of the background. But despite that shift, despite that new thinking about children, over the years, the resources were slow to follow. I'm hoping that's changing now. But when I started at the ARC in 2015, it struck me that despite 20 years of art making for children, it was very difficult to discern what you would traditionally call repertoire. And this is what I kind of want to focus on in the context of this series, and it's thinking about the canon in particular. Because I started to consider, why should this be the case? Is it just an ARC issue, or is it more broadly an issue within theatre making for children? And I discovered that children's plays are very infrequently revived beyond their first production. And often a revival, if it is done at all, is often done by the same artist who may have conceived the piece in the first instance, which is markedly different from my experience of grown-up theatre. This perplexed me for another reason, because one of the joys of operating in a theatre for children and young audiences area is that the audience is constantly renewing itself, so that a child who comes to see a show at the ARC when he or she is 4, is seeing something completely different in 3 or 4 years' time. But by the same token, it really makes the idea for the creation of a repertoire of work that can speak to several generations. So in the review that we undertook of the ARC in 2015 and 2016, we decided that we would take a new look at how we created theatre in order to investigate the self-conscious attempt to create a repertoire. My hope was that by doing so, we would also be creating a visible momentum around art making for children, which asserted its equal status and its equal artistic merit. Because although new writing is my passion, and commissioning and producing new plays has been the single consistent element of my career and my practice, I know too that in order for plays to really live, they need more than one production, and they need more than one interpretation. So we created a commissioning and a producing policy which had the twin aims of creating repertoire for artistic purposes and for our audience, but also had the self-conscious goal of being its own advocacy tool. And for me, that's still something that is required. We still need to advocate for the equal treatment of work by children. And so we needed to start creating the conditions which would make it impossible for that work to be dismissed. And many of the strategies that we applied to that work would be common to any new writing project. So commissioning a diverse range of excellent artists, self-consciously creating the model whereby a play for children would have a lengthy run in the way that new writing really requires a 2 or 3 week run in order to have a sense of its own life. And we created a 2-show day model so that we would maximize our audience. All of these things sound self-evident, but some of them are self-consciously ordained in order that the professional media, critics, reviewers, etc., would be able to see children's work presented in exactly the same kind of model as an adult show. And the length of run was very important self-conscious decision for us. So through this process, we have created a commissioning portfolio and commissioned new plays by Kate Heffernan, Wayne Jordan, Tom Lane, Sean Dunn, Carmel Winters, and Anna Carey. The latter two, The Maestro and Mosquito by Carmel Winters and The Making of Molly by Anna Carey, which is an adaptation of her own novel, will both be produced next year. They've been deferred because of our recent COVID experiences. But this portfolio of work is intended to be an investment in child audiences, with the self-conscious ambition that this work will be revived multiple times. And it's an experiment for us to see how we ourselves can create our own sense of repertoire. Whether other people approach that canonically or not is not for us to decide, but it is a self-conscious strategy to really assert the primacy of new work on the one hand, but also to bring an ethical approach to it, which means that the artists reap the benefit of multiple productions, but also to the state, who is largely supporting this work through their tax euros, can also see what a sustained investment in new work for children looks like. So I'll leave it there. I'll be very happy to take any questions later about how we've done it, the kind of processes that we have applied to the actual theatre making, and our hopes for the future. And we will share some clips with you in the chat as well. Thank you.
Fantastic, Aideen. Thank you so much. And I'd be curious in the discussion afterward to hear about those processes, especially when thinking about keeping the initial ideas and motivations of the arc coming off of the convention in mind as you create this repertoire. So now we're going to move on in the conversation and probably pick up on this idea of children as participants, not only as audience members, but as artists as well, with our next speaker, Michael Chang. I'm delighted to introduce Michael, who is a composer, musician, and performer. In 1998, he moved from Seattle to Ireland and immersed himself in Galway's vibrant traditional music scene, where he now, well, pre-pandemic, hosts several trad sessions per week and has contributed and performed on over 35 albums to date. So in 2009, Michael began collaborating with Branar Theatre de Fáistí, where he has since worked as a composer, musical director, and performer on 8 productions. His most recent collaborations include composing the score for Branar's Galway 2020 production, Schoenenberger, an interactive and immersive theatre experience that realizes the evolution of the Irish language, and also co-writing and performing their show Rockin' Rhymes, producing 2 albums of the recorded songs. Very fun show. He's also spent the past several years collaborating with creative sensory educator Phillida Eves, devising and performing shows for neurodiverse children. Development for their most recent show, Hear Our Voice, included collaborations with Tim Webb, who's the artistic director of Oily Cart in the UK, members of the Rijeka Puppet Theatre, and the Abbey Theatre's 5x5 initiative. Hear Our Voice was featured in Babro the past 2 years and continues to tour schools throughout Ireland. So welcome, Michael. Looking forward to hearing more about these projects.
Thank you, Heidi. And thank you for having me here today for a part of this panel. I would just briefly talk about my background. As Heidi mentioned, I come from Seattle, and I was classically trained on the violin since I was 5. So ever since I was at a young age, I've been performing in some capacity, maybe, as for recitals, for, my grades as a violinist when I was younger, and also in different orchestras and symphony groups as I grew up. And then when I was in college, I was playing in different bands, different genres of music. So as a performer, as someone who does perform, and I think a lot of the people may be watching this panel now are performers themselves, you become very hyper aware of who you're performing with and making sure you have the right kind of vibe, right kind of feelings going on, and the right kind of groove, I suppose. But also you become acutely aware of your audience and really how they're perceiving the show and whether or not they're engaged. And really what I'd like to speak about today in my time here is about engagement and maybe, how that's perceived, because I think for many different audiences, that can mean many different things, when, I had the fortune, as Heidi mentioned there, I've had the fortune to work with Branar Theatre de Fáistí for the last 12 years. And, we do a lot of work devising our shows. A lot of it is improvisational play until we create ideas that eventually form scenes, and we work together to create a story. We have some relationships with schools where we can go into schools and try to try out these scenes in front of these test audiences and see how they respond. And then we take that feedback and go back and work on more things, and then maybe revisit the school again until the show is at a place where we think it's ready. So when you're in these schools, when you go do a show for adults, adults are fairly preoccupied with how they're perceived, and how they're perceiving things even. So with children, a child won't pretend they like something if they don't. And that becomes immediately apparent, right away. That's instant feedback, whether the child is with you or not. And that's very valuable information to take with you. So, I did a show with Branar for years. Now, one of the great things I love about Branar and its artistic director, Mark McLaughlin, one of the ethos of Branar is, big shows for little citizens. And the idea there is that, we don't try to dumb down the theater. We don't try to dumb down the show for children's eyes and ears and brains. Like, they're very smart people. And in fact, they're more honest than most adults. So we really try to make sure the show is true and has heart and has real feelings, real world feelings. We don't try to make it a show that only kids can access, but we do try to make it accessible at every level. So, I think we strive to educate children in some way, but not in traditional ways. Like we do Chang, like Heidi mentioned, is a show about the evolution of the Irish language. We did a show 1916 about 1916 clearly, but I think in other ways we try to educate children by showing that theater can be made by anybody. Really, theater is accessible, and that we use things like paper. Like we did one show called Blah, which is the entire set is made of paper, created by our designer Maeve Clancy. And so we try to create shows that show that these things can be made at home, and you can do theater at any level at home without even having to do to be part of a professional company or anything. Just try to pique some interest in children and trying to get them to maybe want to become theater makers in the future. We did a show called Clown Lear, The Children of Lear, many years ago. We must have toured around maybe 200 schools. We were on tour for a while, and all these shows, after the show, we invite the audience to participate in kind of a Q&A and ask them, what did you see that you liked, or what did you see that interested you, and what did you hear, And the show featured live music, and we'd ask them, what did you hear and what did you see? And a lot of children, of course, these are children between the ages of maybe 5 and 10, from senior infants to 4th class. And a lot of these children, of course, they had heard music, in their lives. Most of them had, at least. And some of them had even seen instruments, but many of them had never really seen an instrument make a sound, an instrument create a sound, like a violin being plucked or a concertina being played. And so they couldn't really associate what they heard with what they were seeing before that time. So that was really educational for them, and we also tried to have these instruments create sounds that maybe aren't traditionally music. For example, we have like a viola like this, that you could make it sound like a seagull, or things like that. Or you could have maybe the bellows of a concertina be pressed in and out, and then reeds muted, so you have like a whooshing sound and things like that to create like a swirly sea storm. So we try to create educational opportunities in those ways as well, that aren't actually really teaching, but just kind of showing them what you can do. So my work with Branar over the years had led me to also work with a woman named Phillida Eves. Heidi mentioned her as well, and Heidi herself has some experience working with Phillida. And Phillida Eves is a creative sensory educator who works a lot with children, neurodiverse children on the autistic spectrum, and also children with profound and multiple learning disabilities. And we started working together. And Phillida's main ethos, it seems, is to work with children and try to create agency and give these children agency to make decisions and help create the story with us. So it's very different to my experience previously in theater, where we have an idea, we perform the show. It's we have a point A and point B. You have a certain mark, you hit the mark, you say your line, you do your action. Everything is quite structured. With these children, you don't really know what's going to happen. And the idea of that is that you give those children an opportunity to play a role in deciding what happens. So we were lucky enough to get some funding through the Abbey Theatre, called their 5x5 initiative. We were able to travel up to Dublin and work with the school for a week to just help develop a show we called Listen Up. And one of the things I've learned, which is so important, I think one of the most valuable things I've learned working with Philida in particular, and working with children on the spectrum, neurodiverse children, is that a lot can happen by just waiting, by just waiting for things to happen. And it sounds funny to say, because I think when you work certainly with other actors trying to improvise a scene, there's no waiting allowed, really. You've got to always be initiating some sort of activity. But with this kind of work, we just create a situation, an environment where it's safe. The children feel safe. We provide them maybe with instruments, maybe with something like chimes like these, where they can play these chimes and see if they can make music. We can maybe provide them with pens so they can maybe create like their own music by color-coded chimes and things like that, just to see what happens. And it's amazing in the silence of what can occur. And so, this video I'd like to show now is just part of that development process called Listen Up. We did in Dublin 2 summers ago. It's about 2.5 minutes long, but what's interesting is that I'm impressed by the editors, because there must have been many minutes of footage of just us waiting for things to happen and watching the children and having them feel safe and feel like they could be empowered to make a decision to do something on their own. And we would follow that. We would just follow their action and try to create a show out of it. So here's an example of here's just a video that the Abbey created, which documents our work for that week. I'll just share my screen. As I mentioned there, and as Philida mentioned, it's really important work that, it's really important that we try to share the experience of theater with these children, because, not many people are going into schools and classrooms and working with these children to show them theater and get them involved. And our idea is really to get out there and try to have these children help devise a story with us and create a story. So after we did development with Listen Up, we started working with other people, as far as Heidi was mentioning there, with Tim Webb of Oily Cart and the Eureka Puppet Theater, to devise different ideas and create different environments. And we created a show called Hear Our Voice, which basically takes the children on a camping adventure through the woods and outside and through tents and things like that. And when I was talking earlier about engagement, it's very interesting when you're working with neurodiverse children, because engagement can mean very different things, like I said earlier, very different things to very different people. And so we, for some people, engagement is sitting there watching the show. They're focused on what's happening. For other people, some people, it's very different. So for example, sorry, I'm kind of rambling. We have 6 children on a neurodiverse children come into the show, usually 6 maximum, and they might have 4 minders or people within their teachers looking after them. And that's it. That's all we can really have in one room at one time. And in that given 6 people, maybe 3 of those children might be what we would call traditionally engaged. They would be focused on what's happening and really watching. But another child might be walking around in the perimeter of the area, just observing from a distance. And for that person, that's engagement. Another person might be asleep at your feet as you do the show. And for them, they're so relaxed and so comfortable, that's their engagement, that they feel safe enough to sleep. And these are all things that I've learned as a performer to accept as engagement. It really can be as diverse as that. And so this show that we did called Hear Our Voice is a show we did. It's camping experience, and we have different just kind of traditional camping scenes we take them through and try to create different sensory experiences for them as well, like water and heat and music. It's always live music if we can do it. And I'll just show you a video for that now. So I'm just aware of the time here, so I'll just wrap up by just saying, theater is for everyone, really, So our goal really with Philida and myself and with Branar certainly is to try to bring theater to as many audiences as possible, whether those are neurodiverse audiences or audiences PMLD. All audiences are important, and I'm going to strive to continue to contribute to that if I can.
Thank you so much, Michael. It was wonderful to see those videos, and I can almost feel those hand warmers and smell the fresh air. It's just such a sensory experience for those young people, and the joy really showed through that. So I'm excited to talk more on that and about how theater is for everyone later on. Thanks so much. So now we're going to move on to continue this conversation about children being co-participants in creating art and the educational and the artistic values of this work by introducing our next two presenters. I'm very happy to introduce first Dr. Fiona McDonagh, who is a lecturer in drama and theatre studies at Mary Immaculate College in the University of Limerick, where she teaches on the BA in Contemporary and Applied Theatre Studies. Fiona was the co-artistic director of Cups and Crowns Children's Theatre Company for more than 10 years. Her research interests include theatre for young audiences, devising practice, drama education and arts education, and her publications have previously appeared in Irish Educational Studies and Research in Drama Education, the Journal of Applied Theatre and Performance. Her recent work includes co-editing forthcoming in July, 2-volume edited collection, The Golden Thread, Irish Women Playwrights from 716 to 2016, with Dr. David Clare and Dr. Justina Cassie. The work holds 42 essays written by leading and emerging Irish theatre scholars and practitioners. Dorothy and Fiona are longtime theatre and research collaborators. So you're very welcome, Fiona.
Thank you, Heidi.
I'll also introduce now Dr. Dorothy Morrissey, who will be joining straight after Fiona. So Dr. Dorothy Morrissey is a lecturer in drama education at Mary Immaculate College, Limerick as well. She teaches on initial teacher education programs and is course leader of the college's MA in Education and the Arts. She also coordinates the college theater's artist residency programs. Dorothy's teaching and research interests include arts education partnerships, and teacher identity, theater for young audiences, and representations of gender in the arts and education. She's currently working on a Department of Education and Skills commissioned evaluation of a national school-based initiative, Creative Clusters. And she is co-author with Dr. Alva Kenny of a Department of Education and Skills commissioned report on teacher-artist partnership in Ireland's primary schools. Additionally, Dorothy has extensive experience as a primary teacher and in teacher professional development. Dorothy, you're welcome as well. And Fiona, you can start whenever you're ready. Thanks so much for being here both.
Great, thank you. Could I ask for the first slide to go up, please? That's great, thank you. I'll just do a small introduction. Thanks so much, Heidi. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today in such great company. So thank you so much for the invite and for bringing attention to TYA within your webinar program. When myself and Dorothy began speaking about this webinar, we started to discuss the projects in which we've worked together and apart. And we kind of came to the idea of collaboration perhaps being an interesting theme because it's so integral to everything that we do. Not just in terms of our partnership, myself and Dorothy, our partnership and working together, but I suppose collaboration within research projects, within the classroom context, within artistic or theatrical activity that we engage in. And we always seem to be looking to create spaces of negotiation and spaces where we can engage in dialogical medium making. And what was really interesting about that initial conversation is that we remembered one of our first projects, which was a performance project called Some Say I. And it actually began as a project with teachers. But as it moved along, the focus quickly moved to us, and it became a process of self-inquiry because we started to see shifts in our identity as myself and Dorothy were collaborating. And Dorothy started to notice an emerging artist identity. And for me, it was this emerging teacher identity. So I guess I'm introducing this idea because we noticed the impact of collaboration on our own identities from the start of our working relationship. So at the heart of our work, there's always a sense of, I suppose, two worlds colliding, the arts world and the education world, where, for me as a theatre maker and an artist coming into academia and then stepping into that world, and then working then with Dorothy, and for her to be working with me, and that idea of her becoming an artist and a theatre maker too. So it's always been a conversation between the two of us, and between the two worlds. So one of us was always stepping out of our familiar world into another, and we're always trying to find harmonies. So today we're going to both talk about two projects, and we hope this will, the two projects will illustrate this understanding of collaboration and what we've learned from our own forms of collaboration and how that can inform professional practice. So the project I would like to begin to discuss, or to begin with, is a project which happened in 2017. It's one that we've spoken about before, but I don't think we've ever come at it from this angle of the workings of the parties involved. So in 2007, we undertook a project using theatre to disrupt dominant gender narratives. So we were working with drama and theatre and looking to trouble gender with infants. So, sorry, next slide, please. So in terms of that project, the genesis of the project, it began as a conversation between myself and Dorothy. We had been collaborating a lot at that point. And we had talked about different ideas of I suppose, different directions we wanted to move in. And my understanding of Dorothy at that time is she had a lifelong interest in gender. Some would say obsession, but she was always talking about gender, and that was kind of informing my understanding of gender too. And that led me to a podcast called Gendosaurus Rex by a Scottish artist, in which the artist looked at genderless characters in performance. So I introduced Dorothy to that podcast, and in turn she then introduced an MA student of hers at the time, Alva Curran, who was an infant teacher, who was at that time doing her MA, and she was looking at gender in the classroom and the exploration of gender in the classroom. So all of these ideas came together in order for this project to happen. But it was, I suppose, it's interesting in the sense that it was different forms of collaboration happening before we came together. Could I have the next slide, please? So the intention of this project was to create possibilities for children to reimagine dominant discourses of gender. So we were looking to devise, with the input of children, of the infant age range, we're looking to devise a short piece of theatre that would involve two genderless characters. And next slide, please. So in terms of the collaboration, there were 4 parties involved, if you'd like. So first of all, Dorothy and I, as I said, had collaboration on a few things in the past, and actually we had co-taught a number of times in different modules. So we'd worked together a lot. So within this project, she was going to act as a performer and also a theatre maker, as well as a researcher. And in the initial stages, I was also a researcher, theatre maker, co-artist, if you like. But eventually, and reluctantly, I became a performer, which I will talk about a little bit later. So the other party involved then was Alva. And as I said, she was an MA student with Dorothy at the time. And her work, her MA research was around gender and that the notion of bringing gender, exploring gender in the classroom. So we knew that Alva had an informed knowledge of gender theory and post-structural theory because of her MA work. We also knew from working with her in the classroom and within lectures that she knew how to engage well with the subject matter, but also she had a way of working with children, and we'd seen this, which was very open. So in that sense, she was able to ask open questions, and she was, able to probe children's responses and elicit these responses that we were looking for. So she had a way of working that was really collaborative as well, and open, that we thought would be very important for the project. Also, importantly, as outside researchers, it's quite difficult to get a lot of time with children in a classroom, so it's always limited. So having Alva involved meant that this would enable a prolonged engagement. So in that sense, her role became crucial. So that collaboration with the teacher in the classroom became a massive part of this project, because she was able to open up spaces for the children to imagine, to question, I suppose, to discover things for themselves rather than directing them. And she had this pre-existing relationship with them. And so in that sense, it offered so much. So even in the sense of the feedback or the insight or the observations she was giving us afterwards, after our interactions with the students, because of her relationship and her time in the classroom with them, she was able to observe the subtle changes in thinking and behaving that we wouldn't been privy to, or maybe wouldn't have been able to observe ourselves because we didn't have that existing relationship with them. So in that sense, we could access more information through her. So she became integral to the project. The last person, I shouldn't call him party, the last person involved was Dave Daly, and he was also doing an MA at the time. And both myself and Dorothy had again worked with him in the classroom, you know, in lecture and workshops, but also in different other smaller projects. So he came in as a performer and as a co-artist. He's a musician as well. But he actually had to step out of the performing role because we noticed a big difference between his physique and Dorothy's physique in terms of the performance. So then that's when I stepped in as a performer in the project. So that just gives you a sense of the collaboration that was happening across this project. I just, if you don't mind putting up the next slide, I'll just give you a sense of the overall project. So in terms of the project, you'll see there, just to give you the steps involved, the first part of the project, we generated photographs of 2 genderless characters in everyday situations, which we sent to Alva. And then she chose photographs that she thought would speak the most. She then showed them to the children, and she encouraged responses to the photographs. She then relayed the responses to us. And then we use these responses to develop a piece of theatre. We then presented a work in progress to the children. And at this stage, it was becoming clear as well that they had a lot to say and a lot to offer. And it wasn't always after the performance, it would filter out in different ways, in different conversations. And that again showed us how valuable Alva was in terms of, you know, when these conversations were happening. It's not always directly after a performance. So then from those responses to the work in progress, we then devised a final performance. And again, we presented this to the children, and then Alva and Dave elicited more responses to that in order for us to develop an understanding of their interpretation of what we were doing. And I'll just ask you to put up the final slide, please. Thank you, Sarah. So I just wanted to bring this this final slide to your attention because it's the idea then of the children as, I suppose, collaborators. When we think of them moving from receivers of work to co-creators. So the children's responses were used to develop the theatrical work. And actually, not just in terms of the content or the subject and the direction we're moving, even in how we were presenting what we were presenting. They were noticing details about the characters that we weren't. So, you know, of course, in terms of the subject matter, you know, that idea of playing with this, you know, disrupting this notion of gender, they were really interesting responses, but also in terms of the aesthetic performance and what we were doing, they had a lot to say about that as well, which was really interesting. So by presenting the work in progress and the final performance, it was allowing us to test our interpretations of what the children, of their initial responses. So we were allowed to kind of play with this idea, well, they're giving us this information about what they're seeing. Now let's play it back to them, and it's our own interpretation. And again, then we could elicit more responses. So it was really interesting in that sense. And it just brought, I mean, for the whole project, it brought it round then that there were all of these parties collaborating at the same time. I'll just let Dorothy take over from here.
Thank you. And could I have the first slide, please? Thank you. I'm going to look at another project that Fiona and I worked together on. And in that project, education students and theatre students co-participated in an undergraduate module on theatre for young audiences. Now, this was a big deal in that it was a cross-faculty collaboration. So those kinds of things, given the timetabling and all kinds of logistical issues, can be very difficult to organise. Now, the rationale for having the 2 cohorts of students working together in the same module. Now, prior to that, Fiona had done a Theatre for Young Audiences module with her theatre students, and I had been doing one with the education students. And at one stage, actually, Fiona had actually taught that module with the education students. So we had taught TYA modules separately. So we decided, given our history of collaborating together, to bring them together. And also our history as collaborators fit very much into the Arts in Education Charter, which is predicated on partnerships at all levels of the education system between education and the art world. And it also fit very much into the three projects that have been spawned by that charter: Teacher-Artist Partnership, the Creative Schools, which Aideen referred to earlier, and Creative Clusters. So given the possibilities opened up by the charter for teachers and artists to work in partnership, we wanted to enable the students to appreciate the possibilities afforded by partnership by co-participating in a module on TYA grounded in teacher-artist partnership, in that Fiona and I were working in this instance as teacher and artist. We identified ourselves very much in this instance as teacher and artist, given that we felt that the students would be more likely to identify me as a teacher and perhaps Fiona as an artist. Though, as Fiona has said, those identities are fluid and shift and move all the time in our collaborations with each other. Next slide, please. Now, the teaching approach we used in the module was very much modeled on an approach to aesthetic education developed by the Lincoln Center in New York. And this approach is grounded very much in the work of Maxine Green, and it's premised on enabling students to notice what there is to be noticed in an artwork. In this case, works of theatre for young audience. So we were using this approach to engage the students with works of theatre for young audience. This approach involves pre-engagement activities which are designed to enable the students to notice what there is to notice, and thereby perhaps see more and hear more in the artwork than they might otherwise do. Then there's the viewing of the artwork, and then there's the post-engagement activities, which are designed to deepen the students' engagement with the artworks. So we were using this approach to enable the students to engage with theatre for young audiences. Next slide, please. Now, our teaching, as we were teaching, we were also collecting data, because we were also staging this as a research project. So the data that we collected involved audio recordings of our pre and post-class meetings, focus group interviews with the students, one conducted midway and the other at the end point. Now, I undertook the focus group interviews with the education students, and Fiona undertook them with the theatre students, because we felt that that would be better, that we'd be more likely to get more information and more honesty from the students who saw each one of us as their module leader, if you like. And then we also had informal interviews with the students. So what do we mean by informal interviews? We mean conversations that we might have had in class, conversations that we might have had out of class. And the students knew that we were recording these conversations and talking about them in our lecture meetings. There were also the written materials produced by the students in class, video recordings of the student presentations for assessment purposes, and written module evaluation forms completed by the students. Next slide, please. Now, one of if we look, the opportunities provided for are articulated in the charter for partnership and the projects spawned by them. We wanted the students to expose them to this notion of working in partnership with each other. And I've done a lot of work with another colleague, Alvy Kenny, on this whole notion of teacher-artist partnership. And in our work in that project, a lot of the research suggests that when artists come into schools to work with teachers, teachers experience a huge lack of confidence in the presence of an expert. Even teachers who have lots of experience in the arts, when they find themselves in the presence of an expert, they experience a lack of confidence. And one of our ideas in getting the students from both cohorts to work together was to overcome this notion of the teacher's lack of confidence when they might go eventually to work with artists in schools. But interestingly, with our students, we also found that not just the student teachers experienced an initial lack of confidence in the presence of the theatre students, who they kind of saw as certainly more expert than they were, but the theatre students also experienced an initial lack of confidence in the presence of the education students. Now, I think unwittingly we may have generated this because we began with the theory behind the Lincoln Center method that we were using, which the students saw as very much grounded in education and thereby not relevant to them. There were also status issues in that in a college of education and the liberal arts, the education student or the theatre students perceived the education students to have greater status. Also, the education students were third year students, the theatre students were second year students, and there were 19 education students and 6 theatre students. So big issues in relation to status, which we hadn't considered before beginning the module. So there was a perception among the theatre students that this isn't for us. Now, the whole issue of status, of course, didn't impact on the education students because it's no more than white privilege or male privilege. Those who actually have the privileged status don't notice that they have it. Next slide, please. So given that didn't work out really according to plan, in that we feel that we didn't really bring particularly the theatre students on board to the extent that we feel we might have, we're going to repeat it and obviously make some changes to the module. We're not going to introduce the theory firsthand. We're going to begin this time with the exploration of the works of TYA using the methodology, and then unpack the methodology afterwards. Also, I think we probably needed to draw more attention to the way Fiona and I, explicit attention to the way that Fiona and I were actually working as partners in the project. Like, the students did see us disagree. They did see us not know the answers to the problems. They did see us defer to each other at various stages. But I think we possibly needed to underpin the processes that we were engaged in, and to link those more closely as well to the processes that teachers and artists would engage in projects in schools. So now at this point, I'll move to the final slide, and just for one moment to consider the implications of our work as collaborators for professional practice. And in professional practice here, I'm really talking about professional practice instead of the theatres, in terms of theatre as opposed to education. And if you go look at the project that Fiona described, you see that a big deal in getting the children's voices and enabling the children to be co-participators or co-creators in the making of the theatre work was the role of the teacher. So I think that has implications for collaborations with children into the future, that the necessary collaboration of the teacher. Also, in terms of teacher-artist partnership, given that teachers particularly can feel not so confident in the presence of an artist, I think it's important that at undergraduate level that they would begin to work with people who are involved in theatres. But also I think there's a need for us to bridge the gap between what the theatre students think they want and what we think they might need. Because we do know that many of the theatre students will end up working in educational contexts, perhaps not in schools. So I suppose in a sense we need to sell that better. And also, if you look at all the projects in teacher-artist partnership, very few of them are actually theatre projects. So we need to cultivate that need in education students and in theatre students to work together on teacher-artist partnerships in theatre into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona and Dorothy, so much. Those are really interesting provocations to start our conversation now. And I'm feeling like I have so many questions for many of you, but from what I'm hearing that coming out of that is this idea of collaboration and looking at how we train our teachers and our artists in college to be co-collaborators with children and with one another. And I see that also with this incredible need for the role of the teacher to be recognized in all artistic projects, including what Aideen was talking about in developing the repertoire and what Michael was talking about in working with children, neurodiverse children. So I'm going to open the chat up for questions to our panelists, and we already have a few coming in. So I want to just start off by asking everyone on the panel if you would just say a few words about what your belief the role of a classroom teacher is as a partner in the projects that you were speaking about today. And if anything that Dorothy had just spoken about, as well as Fiona in collaboration, resonates with that too.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in, Heidi. I think for us, the teacher is the key partner, but also the key mediator with our schools program. They can also have an impact on the attendance of a child in a non-school context also, you know, so we're really conscious that teachers are playing a key role in terms of our direct relationship with them, but in terms of the indirect circle of influence that a teacher has on a child's participation in any arts practice, that reach is really very wide. We think that the teacher has a mediating role as well as a direct championing role, so to speak. And I think the depth of those two things can go up or down depending on the nature of the experience and the nature of the work. Today, I spoke mostly about our theatre practice, but we also have a workshop practice that goes alongside that. And the nature of a teacher's engagement in a workshop setting at the ARC will necessarily be very different from the kind of role that that teacher will play in bringing children to be part of a theatre and a performance experience. So as Dorothy and Fiona have kind of, I'm sure they've only just touched, it's just the tip of the iceberg, but that the depth of engagement by teachers really informs the nature of the child's experience. It's absolutely profound. And it is not only curricular, it is also about inculcating and sharing with children the conventions that go with participation. So that is as much about being comfortable in how you show up and being, you know, literate and included in the practice of observing theatre making, as it is actually about the learning part of it. So we would see those two things as crucial. There's sometimes a little bit of a tension for us, I think, because we don't talk about education very confidently within the work of the ARC, but we talk about learning a lot. And so sometimes I think we are necessarily reluctant to position ourselves in any educational context because it's not our expertise, but we are very happy and comfortable for teachers to be able to work with us to do that.
That's great, thank you. Yeah, definitely the openness that you were talking about, Fiona, of even the teacher who you worked with in the infant project, their open style of questioning as well made such a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think because, you know, that type of style, you're not directing their thinking, you know, if you, and it goes back to, I suppose, what I was initially saying, that creating spaces for negotiation and for meaning making. And I think that comes with practice as well, but also what the teacher in that instance, in that project offered, she had these pre-existing relationships with the students. So she knew them really well. And that offered so much to us in the sense that, you know, from making theatre for young audiences, you're used to looking at the audience response and reading, but then there's another level, you know, when you know the audience, and so she was able to sit and enjoy the performance and you know, understand the performance and the intentions, but she also had this relationship with them that it wasn't the immediate reactions weren't as important as the days following that, because that's when they would have thought a little bit further about it, or they would have had conversations in the playground and suddenly they're coming back in with questions for her, or she'd open up another conversation and it had, so, you know, the performance had resonated in another way with them. So that I think that's what it offered us. So her approach to her interaction with the students, absolutely, her existing relationship, and also the time she had with them as well. And then we had such a good working relationship with her. We had so much trust in what she was doing, you know, so I think that was part of it too as well. And she trusted us. So there was a lot of things at play, but definitely it would have been a very different project if we didn't have her involved. And I think Dorothy would agree with that.
The whole notion of collaboration, it took, before ever Fiona and I entered into a project together, we dipped our toes in the water. With Alba, she dipped her toes in the water with us over 2 years of an MA program, and we dipped our toes in the water with her. So this notion of the building the relationships required to do what we did takes a long time and doesn't actually happen overnight.
Yeah. And I think what you were saying, Aideen, about, or Fiona actually, about the relationship, building the relationship with teachers and how they really know their students. I wondered, Michael, if you had any thoughts about that in the kind of the impressions the teachers had of the students you were working with in the Hear Our Voice project and how that affected the collaboration.
Absolutely. And what Aideen said there about the depth of engagement that the teacher has with the making of the theater in the classroom, that is absolutely vital to how the child experiences that making of theater. And you know what Fiona touched upon there, how the teachers understand the audience. Like when we walk into a classroom with 6 neurodiverse children, we really have never met them before, and even we would have no real preconceived ideas of how they would react to anything we do. So for them to give us a little bit of experience about what we might expect is a very important thing. However, sometimes we find that, you know, you walk into a certain classroom and they'll say, oh, Jonathan loves music. He'll love you playing live music. And then I'll start playing something and he'll be, you know, Jonathan will have a reaction that is very opposite of enjoying the music. So, you know, you don't really know sometimes whether, or you get some teachers that say, oh, he'll just want to fight with you. He won't be engaged at all. But then we find quite the opposite. So, you know, it's interesting. We have relationships with certain schools in Galway where we work with the autistic unit in that school for a period of weeks. And as we learn more about the child, the show takes its own form. And the teachers are also educated by that in some way, because they can find things that we're doing maybe that might help them in their teaching, and we can also learn from what they're telling us about the child. But it takes time, and even, you know, it takes you know, weeks is no time at all in a lifetime, you know. So it just takes time to figure out what works with certain children and what doesn't, and other children that we feel we're really getting momentum with all of a sudden you go the next week and that can be completely gone. So it really is an interesting thing. And having those teachers engaged when they're with those children all the time, they can really keep track of that progress and see where things are going. So I think that having teachers engaged with that process is vital.
Thanks. I'm going to go over to the chat. We have a question there for Dorothy about the teacher-artist partnership. So Branar is asking why you think there are so few theatre projects in teacher-artist partnership, considering that the school play is so prevalent.
Yeah, maybe because the school play is so prevalent that teachers don't. Well, I suppose the first thing to say is that drama is the poor relation in schools. The drama curriculum as it currently stands is out of step with the other curriculum in that there's no focus on connecting what happens in the classroom with what happens in the wider world of the theatre, as there is in the music curriculum and the visual art curriculum. There isn't in the drama curriculum. So there's a sense to see what happens in the classroom in terms of drama education or learning through drama as separate to what happens in the theatre world. So I think that's one of the reasons, which is internal to the schools. Now, I think possibly another reason is that if you look outside the schools and you look at theatre artists, they tend not to work as sole traders, if you like. They tend to work as groups. Whereas you'd have more visual artists operating as sole traders. So it's much easier for you to engage with a school as a single person than it might be as a group. And because theatre artists are so used to working together, they might not see the possibilities for themselves in terms of working as an individual artist at schools. They're just perhaps some of the reasons.
It's really interesting. Because I have noticed that as well. And can I just clarify, are you speaking about primary schools?
Yes.
For the most part? Okay. Because we have another question that came up from Aisling about the age range. And I think in general, we were talking about primary school age. And I know the ARC creates work, I believe, Aideen, correct me if I'm wrong, for everyone, but with a focus on children up to 12. So Aisling is asking a question for Aideen, that it feels that there is a gap in TYA in Ireland for the 12 to 21 age group. And she'd like to know what your thoughts are on this work for that age range.
Well, she's right, is the first thing. Yeah, it is very complex. I've always made the argument that if it was the case that the ARC was set up to deliver children's right to art and culture for the ages of children between the ages of 2 and 12, then clearly we are missing the corollary, which is either an organization like the ARC extending its reach to a broader age range, or it is a particularly focused process which addresses that age range. Because in terms of the life of a child or a young person, it's clear that you don't suddenly stop your interest in the arts at 12 just because the state-funded infrastructure doesn't exist. But it is the case that you could very easily lose your passion and lose the ability to practice it in any meaningful way. Because it has always occurred to me that if you are creating policy that really takes life cycle into account, we're effectively dropping the ball at the age of 12, where things are already so complex for children who are already undertaking other transitions from primary into secondary school. And I think we have established that we haven't always, in our processes and systems more broadly as a society, we haven't handled those transitions in a very sophisticated manner, let's say. So it does strike me that there is an absolute gap there. And for a child or a young person, the implication is that, you grow out of childish things and immediately, what are you attending project, or are you off to the Abbey to see a show that, there is very little consideration in the interim and in the intervening years. So our sister organization, the Unicorn in London, for example, has the mission and the mandate to make work for children and young people, and has a space that actually allows those diverse audiences to sit alongside each other. So there are a number of ways of addressing this. Arguably, I mean, I'm saying this quite late in the conversation, but you know, the TYA label can be as enabling as it can be disabling, I think, because it does create the impression that we must resource this work in its own and on its own, whereas surely there are other ways of addressing it too, whereby other organizations, I mean mainstream theatres, for example, could be making work for that audience as well, without there having to be a dedicated organization to do so. So I would be arguing for both and of those solutions rather than one or the other, but it is most definitely a gap.
It makes me wonder about the students you're teaching at Mary I, Fiona and Dorothy, and like what their experience of theatre for children is in that time period from 12 to 21 or whatever age it is that they're studying. And it brings me into the next question, actually, from Marianne. I teach with Marianne a TYA module, very similar, it sounds like, to the one you're teaching at Mary I, in which we work with drama students and children's studies students. So there's a mix of backgrounds. And so Marianne is saying that we have the honor of having a child audience attend virtually and in person, and the students for their final work in progress. And she's saying here that the teachers have not only been instrumental in bringing the students to the performances, but they have also recorded feedback sessions and visual arts responses for our students, which have fed into the reflective essays that our students are writing then about how their work is perceived by children. So we've had members of the professional TYA artistic community attend the final showings and provide feedback from Branar and Barbaro. So we have found this module has a great profound effect on students' experiences and their future pathways as artists and educators. So she's asking here, how important is access to training and professional development for those hoping to work with theater for young audiences? So that kind of access in college level or afterward, how important would you say that is? This is open to everyone, but I'm targeting Fiona because of the module that you're working with Dorothy on.
Oh, it's extremely important, and it's really interesting. You know, just working with my students, they have seen so little TYA work by the time they've come to college. It's really, you know, so a lot of what I'm introducing to them is new. And if they've seen something, I mean, it's rare. Perhaps it would have been TIE, would have been a little bit different, or, you know, they would have always have worked. A lot of our students would have come through the youth theatre system as well. So I'm introducing, you know, definitely, and I think Dorothy would probably agree, we're introducing TYA performance and production work, and it's new to them. In terms of the making process, it's a lot of the same actions and techniques and processes that they'd usually do, you know, making any type of theatre. So we do kind of hone in on, you know, the child audience and what that means, and you know, all the processes involved in that. That does take further thinking, and as you know, Heidi, you know, there's different initiatives now outside of education. For instance, Branar's Tiny Shows, there's lots of opportunities now for artist development that's happening. And I think it's really important, because I know I was a TYA maker for a long time. And when I began 20 years ago, we didn't really know how to make the work, because it was, you know, TYA was still in its infancy, and I came from, I suppose, a TIE background as well, because I was educated in the UK. So there was all of these things happening, and I guess so. When I started making work, that it was still, you know, although Team existed, Graffiti existed, Replay, you know, they were really big companies, but as a small company, we were kind of learning, you know, trial and error. And someone asked me yesterday about an age range. How did you know? And I said, we made a lot of different shows, put them on, and then looked at what the audience were doing. And sometimes it was older kids going, and sometimes they were looking at another direction. So it was real trial and error. But like now 20 years on, we know a lot more. We have a lot more understanding. And as a TYA community, there's a lot more knowledge around performance work, creating performance, just as Michael was, talking about, our understanding of audiences, the involvement of the teacher, the different artists that can work together. So we know a lot more. It's very difficult to put that all into one module. It's really difficult because what you're doing is you're introducing TYA to some people who've never seen it before. And there's a lot to put in it. So actually it's really important there are opportunities outside of the degree to I suppose, build your practice, build your understanding of this type of work. And I think, to be on my soapbox, everyone knows this is going to come. I think that's what the TYA community do really well. And again, I'd bring Branar up as a really good example of, that artist community coming together and helping each other. And what Branar do with the Tiny Show initiative, for anyone that doesn't, know about this initiative, they offer an opportunity for artists to come together. Sometimes you haven't worked together, sometimes they have, perhaps of different disciplines, to come and play in a room for 3 days to see how they work together, see what they can come up and see if their idea will take flight. Is it worth putting more time into it, more money into it? So in that sense, it's helping their development, their collaboration with new people or other people, they're making new work. So that's another opportunity for them to develop. So I think there needs to be more opportunities like that. And I think particularly with and again, I don't want to talk too much about Branar because they'll kill me, but also to the quality of that type of opportunity as well, because it is, it's a really good initiative. And as a past TYA maker, former TYA maker, I'd love to see more opportunities for professional development for TYA makers. And I think they are out there. I'm just highlighting one that I know quite well. And it is, the more support, the better. Have I talked too much? I haven't. Put myself on mute.
Oh, that's great. I can't believe it. We only have a few minutes left, but I'm really impressed with the bravery that TYA has shown through all of the organizations you work with in terms of the diverse topics and the way that it's continuing to evolve and keep children at the center of it too. So I'm just going to see if there's any more. So there are some lovely comments from the attendees in the chat, and I think I just want to end maybe by asking all of you if you could briefly tell me what you believe the best, excuse me, let me just gather my thoughts here. Going forward, creating access to training, if there's any words of advice for people who are interested in working with children in this collaborative way. And Fiona, I'd be curious to hear, I know we don't have the time now, but more about how the children reacted to this gender neutral performance. But I suppose my final question is if there's any words of advice you have for anyone listening who would be interested in working in collaboration with children and deepening kind of the curriculum as a way moving forward. Dorothy, yeah.
I just say, I suppose I just want to add on to Fiona's, that notion of, in our TYA module, we focus on the students as receivers of TYA rather than as creators of TYA. And in that they, as Fiona pointed out, neither cohort has had much experience of receiving TYA up to that. Now, the other thing as well, and it links into the kind of things that Aideen was saying, and what I said earlier about drama in schools not being linked to TYA. So children don't get the chance all the time. Yes, they go to the Arc sometimes, or they go to other festivals, they go to Barbaro or they go to Bula Boss, and they do, but on a regular basis, this notion of developing children as receivers of theatre isn't embedded in our system either, again, because of the kind of the separateness of the curriculum from what happens in the arts world. Thanks.
Thanks for that.
I would just, encourage people to go out and seek opportunities. Like Fiona very kindly mentioned Branar's Tiny Shows program. There's a lot of programs out there. There must be, I think, because there's a lot of people doing TYA theater. It feels like there's a lot of competition out there. So you know, there's people that I think one of the great things about Branar's Tiny Shows thing is that at the end of the weekend, when you're collaborating with these artists, you do have an opportunity to do a showing, and people are invited to come who all work in TYA, and they're happy to offer their feedback. And so I think just to surround yourself with people that work in that realm and want to create great theater for young audiences, that's the idea really, and the more opportunities I think will arise that way.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I definitely see the through line being collaboration in this work. It's so important with teachers, with students, with artists. And so I'm excited to see where the work goes as we continue the conversation. So I'm going to close now and thank you all so much for your time and for the work that you're doing, which I think is so important for young people today. And thank you very much to NUI Galway for hosting this series, and also for including theater for children in the conversation. And I'd like to just say that Mark from Branar Theatre Company will be on next week's seminar on Irish language, the Irish language panel, Irish language theater panel. So look out for that next week. And this again will be available on YouTube next week if people want to watch back. Thanks all so much and have a wonderful weekend.